So welcome to Wemcast with me, Eoin Walker, the pre-hospital trauma lead. In this episode, we are going to interview Jerome Mowat. Jerome is a paramedic that trained in London for London Ambulance Service and then transitioned to Yorkshire to embrace his love of climbing. He then returned to London during the first and second wave of the COVID pandemic to help out. He features on a fantastic documentary about the life of a paramedic and how he uses climbing to transition from being a paramedic, which actually won a global film festival recently. The film's called Lockdown, Rock Up and follows the life of Jerome as he uses rock climbing to escape, work on the front line of healthcare during COVID-19. The film won the Best Short Prize at the Kendal Mountain Film Festival and celebrates mountaineering and outdoor culture. So the film highlights the challenges Jerome faced, but working both in Yorkshire and in London, and it tells a story about the first few weeks of the March 2020 lockdown. So welcome to the podcast, Jerome.
Thanks very much, Eoin. Thanks for that introduction.
Pleasure, absolute pleasure. So let's just dive into the questions. And just get your perspective on a few things, really. So could you just speak to the main reflections of this, of the movie, Lockdown, Rock Up, and why you first agreed to help make the movie?
Yeah, well, the film really is a combination of what Nico, the filmmaker, and I wanted to express from the pandemic. So Nico works in mainstream TV. His day job is working for a TV show down in London. He does some freelance stuff on the side, but he's also, like me, a passionate climber. He loves the outdoors, he loves getting out. And as is true for many people during the pandemic, it forced him to reevaluate what he was doing, the direction he wanted to move towards, which was ultimately outdoor filming and climbing. So what's interesting is that his father works, he's an A&E doctor, and his sister-in-law is a physio for the NHS. So he wanted to honor the NHS in some way. And I, on the other hand, wanted to show as honestly as possible the reality of working on the front line during the pandemic. And I think many of my friends and family, and probably it's true to say a vast swathe of the population, have felt quite removed from what's going on during the first wave. Like the nature of COVID essentially is it all happens behind closed doors, whether that's people isolating in their rooms, whether it's isolating in hospitals or whatever. So I wanted to connect people to the reality of the pandemic. Now there are significant limitations to what we could film, during the actual movie, especially as an independent filmmaker without a big production company behind you. So we had to kind of mock it up on the ambulance, and we didn't use London, we used Yorkshire because that's where I was at the time. So we used an interview which he did with me as the narrative, to kind of like an overarching narrative, and the whole process was actually really cool and quite interesting. It kind of required quite a broad skill set from both of us. We wanted to make it both relevant to climbers, to experienced climbers, and also to non-climbers, so they would kind of understand. So I hope it was kind of mildly interesting to both parties.
No, it certainly was, Jerome. And what it really orchestrated and showed quite nicely actually was the transition from working on the front line and modalities of working in PPE, working under duress, days and nights, weekend shifts, lots of different disruptive elements to the pandemic, and then quite nicely how you transition to rock climbing and just that kinesthetic feel across the rocks, and just how you connect with rock climbing. So I think it showed both really quite nicely. And Jerome kind of leads me nicely into the second question, really, which is sort of how have you found that rock climbing has helped you transition from a difficult period and time at work?
Absolutely. I mean, I'm a paramedic and I love my job, and I will probably be a paramedic in some capacity for the rest of my career, as we touched on earlier. But I'm also a climber, and climbers have very strong identities. They identify very strongly with the sport. It's one of those kind of fringe sports that I think attract a certain type of person. So without one, I feel like something's missing. I feel a bit incomplete. In our line of work, as you know, we go to some pretty unpleasant places. We see some pretty unpleasant things, whether that's people in pain, life-changing injuries, the death of relatives. We see people at their worst, and it can give you quite a warped sense of humanity and society. It can seem like a very hostile place, full of risk, full of threat. And I think it's unhealthy to dwell on that environment for prolonged periods of time. So through climbing, I go to some pretty epic places, both in the UK and abroad. And I want my memory, I want my thoughts, when I'm thinking and daydreaming, I want them to be filled with those beautiful places, the cliffs, the mountains, the elements. And that works on both a macro and a micro scale. So I love traveling, as many of us do. I love going to these places, to the Alps and Catalonia and wherever, but also thinking about the moves and the holds of a specific route. Like when you project a difficult route, it's like having an intimate relationship with a piece of rock. You learn in such intimate detail the shape of the holds, the difficulty of the moves, how you feel in certain crux passages. Like a 30-meter route, you can have over 100 moves. And each one of those you will learn through repetition, through practice in really great detail. Just being able to visualize a route at, for instance, Malham Cove in the Yorkshire Dales, which is a fantastic place for sport climbing. It's just, like a really pleasurable thing. And I liken it to a form of meditation where your mind has to focus in such great detail to climbing the route. You have to overcome any performance anxiety, overcome any fear in order to be successful. And I think quite a useful comparison is I used to play the cello when I was at school. And learning to recite a piece of music is very similar to projecting a heart route, a route that's near your physical limit. It's like playing a really intricate technical piece of music flawlessly. And when you visualize, you use the occipital lobe. I'm sure I'm going to be shot by some neurologists here, neuroscientists, but as I understand, you use the occipital lobe of your brain and to create these visualizations and simulations. And I always joke that climbers have very overdeveloped occipital lobes, because we're always daydreaming. We're always trying to put ourselves in the position of climbing a route, how we'll feel, how, to the extent of how the sun will feel on our back, the wind will feel. You get to know, routes in quite intimate detail, and I think that's quite a precious thing to have.
That's fantastic, and that kind of kinesthetic feel and/or memory that you can display, even in the moment, or just recollecting those feelings, how that hold feels, how the rock feels, and then maybe identifying with that sounds like it's not only helps you transition, but helps you completely shift your focus away from the immediacy of work and the difficulty of work. So that's fantastic and really actually makes sense to me, Jerome. So that's absolutely fantastic.
Good.
So Jerome, what are some of the fundamental differences that you found working in London compared to working in Yorkshire?
London, for a start, had it much worse than anywhere else in the country by a long way, both in the first wave and in the second wave. So as I said in the film, when the pandemic hit, it's where there was the greatest need. So I felt, and it's my hometown, I really wanted it breaks my heart to see it, in that kind of state. So I felt like I had to give myself to it. And I mean, London is a city like no other. The variety of the kind of calls you go to, the exposure to a whole variety of jobs, the patient demographic. It's just a fascinating place to work. So I love it for that. And there are some conveniences of working in London. I get to work with other paramedics, which I don't in Sheffield or Yorkshire. There are really convenient things like make ready, which just make your life a little bit easier. So, the drugs are prepared, the vehicles are prepared at the start of shift. So that makes working conditions actually quite favorable in London. But working in Sheffield, so there are 3 stations here. Everyone knows each other. It's a bit more of a villagey kind of feel. And, you just build a really strong relationships with your colleagues. And I value both of them. So I prefer working in London, but I also really miss Sheffield and Yorkshire when I'm away.
Jerome, what does, in your mind, rock climbing give you from a mental health perspective? Just when you've been on a tough shift or tough run of shifts, how does it sort of give back to you?
Well, firstly, it gives me a sense of purpose. It gives you a purpose outside of my job. I think as healthcare professionals, if you're a paramedic, a doctor, or a nurse, or whatever, we identify very strongly with our roles. We're very proud of what we do. It's a very noble thing to do, isn't it? To try and improve people's health, their welfare, and occasionally to save their lives, occasionally. And I do identify very strongly with being a paramedic, but I also identify with being a climber. And I was a climber well before. I trained as a paramedic. So it doesn't really matter how bad a shift has gone. I've always feel like I've got a secret weapon, like an identity to fall back on. Climbing is also a very physically demanding sport. I think it's a sport, but it's also a skill and it's a discipline and it's something to be crafted and honed. And to reach your full potential in something like climbing and to climb your hardest, it requires such great focus, determination, attention to detail on quite an obsessive kind of level. So when you're in the zone, as it were, trying to route a boulder problem or whatever, there's no real space for intrusive images, for negative voices. You must be fully present and tap into that flow state that is the holy grail of each effort. You don't always get there, but it's something to strive for. So there have actually been studies on how bouldering in particular is really good for your mental health because it just doesn't give space to anything that may be occupying you at the time. So I'm a big advocate of doing something that gives you an identity outside of your career or your work. And being a really quite a niche activity, albeit growing, there's also a fantastic community of people within it, like a really good support network, which I'm really grateful for. So I don't fully invest myself in the job, in being a paramedic. And it also works the other way around. If I get injured or, if I feel detrained or weak, or have had a bad session, I can also apply myself to work, to clinical development and so on. And I feel that that's what's really been lacking in both ways, really, is the availability to climb. All the climbing walls are shut, and being in London means like outdoor climbing just isn't an option. So I have felt that absence. And when you have a relationship that's so strong with something and it's suddenly taken away, it's like you lose part of your identity. And that's true of many climbers, I think, through the pandemic. So yeah.
Absolutely, and so I'm a big advocate of actually having another identity outside of the workplace, because, like you said, if one is stripped away from you, or sometimes is lost somehow. It's not your whole self which is lost in the process. So absolutely. Now there's a conduit to a second question. I'm going to ask you about the demand profile around the first and second wave, but I think just the way you've answered that nicely around the mental health piece around climbing, just what strains have you seen in the mental health from the front line from other staff, and how's that played out? We'll come back to the first and second wave and how it's escalated, but just from your observations, how have you seen this adversely affect the front line?
Yeah, well, I mean, that's a really important topic, and it's very, I think it's something that's we're having more and more awareness of around health workers and the emergency services in particular. So I have a colleague of mine in Sheffield, and he wrote a really fantastic article about mental health in the ambulance service in particular. Maybe we can just put a little show note and attach the article at the end to this blog. But he says that we're never, our next job could be our last. And that's quite a profound thing, and I think all it takes is to be in the wrong place to see something that's particularly emotive, and who knows how you'll react. That's the thing. It's an unpredictable environment, and we're never quite sure. And I think through the pandemic, we've made some, we had to make some pretty difficult decisions, particularly in the first wave when hospitals were so overwhelmed. Decisions that should have been way above our pay grade about, who to take to hospital, who should stay at home, and potentially, end of life. The article also says that perhaps we should be rethinking how we deal with stress in the ambulance service, which is one, as you probably are aware, paramedics and ambulance staff have some of the highest rates of sickness within the NHS. So going off sick through stress can be quite an isolating experience. And we all know that the best kind of therapy is actually talking to our colleagues, better than any kind of counseling. So after a bad job, without a doubt, speaking to your colleague or colleagues, or going back to the mess room, it's just the best way to decompress. They understand, I think they understand, and that shared experience makes all the difference. It's you can't really go home, and say that kind of stuff, talk about, the young suicide that you've just been to or whatever. It just doesn't, it just doesn't quite have the same effect. There's just not quite the same shared experience there. So, when you've been to a shift, 6 COVID patients during the first wave, 2 of whom arrested, one was a DOA, a dead on arrival. It's just really hard for your family or friends to kind of interpret. So maybe instead of people, staff going off sick and being completely separate, maybe we should be keeping them in the mess room, keeping them on light duties, so we don't totally remove that support network and that routine, which we all kind of work within. So I think we should possibly be having a discussion around better ways to deal with stress in the workforce. I think that we have a long way to go in this respect.
Jerome,
also, we have this in London. It's very unique to London, but we have this huge network of Australian paramedics, which basically we've poached from Australia, and they're fantastic. They brought a new perspective. They brought fresh blood, and they've completely changed the culture within London. They were only just coming in when I left to join the Yorkshire Ambulance Service, and every time I've gone back and there are more Australian paramedics, it's just like a fresh, a breath of fresh air, and it's really pretty awesome to see. And for the last, they come over full of enthusiasm, and they want to travel Europe, and they want to work somewhere different. And I think the fact that they're not able to travel anymore, and the fact that the UK has been so badly affected, particularly London, with COVID means that possibly we'll be seeing some of them leave, and that would be a great shame because they're a really valued part of the ambulance service, the LAS now. So yeah, I think we have a long way to go there as well.
Jerome, could you speak to the current climate from your perspective and how it compares to the first wave? Sort of how quickly has the demand profile for the second wave escalated versus the first?
Yeah, well, so the first wave was very sudden. It kind of we saw it coming from Spain, from Italy, from France, and the effects were very immediate. There was a really quick spike, but also it kind of departed quite quickly as well, quite rapidly. So it was chaos for a month or so, but then it was we had unprecedented levels of the call number just dropped off a cliff, and the first wave was all very new, and that was both a blessing and a curse. Every day we were changing our practice to according to the research that was coming out and so on about how to deal with COVID patients, about PPE. So there were a whole host of challenges that were new, and none of us had worked in a pandemic before, so it was all quite novel. And we were also receiving this vast amount of appreciation and support from the public, which was incredible. We were having recognition that we would never have imagined. Whereas the second wave, well, I think the worst thing about it is that we could all see it coming, and that it was kind of preventable if we had the right political will or public will. I'm not sure, from where it stemmed, but it was preventable. And I think every healthcare professional, every paramedic was just begging for lockdown to come sooner, which sadly it didn't. So it's been chaos, and it's been much bigger. It's had a much bigger impact on the ambulance service, I'd say, and the NHS as a whole. The demand has been really sustained and really high. Between Christmas and New Year, we had the highest call rates in our history. On one day, the call volume went above 8,000 for the first time ever. We were regularly going above 7,500 on a daily basis. There were 500 calls without resources to send, which is dangerous, which is really dangerous. There were cardiac arrests with no resources to send. So this second wave has been way, way harder than the first. Yeah, but thankfully, it seems like things are settling down a little bit from the ambulance perspective. I think the nature of our work is that it's quite transient, so we can see the effects very quickly. When all it takes is a patient to pick up a phone, and we're there. But within hospitals, it's very different because COVID patients will stay days, weeks, or months. So the effects are felt much longer.
Jerome, just the film really does unpack your love of rock climbing quite nicely, and also, like you said, the transient time of the first and second wave, and how, from your narrative, how quickly the evolution of things were changing. But how have you optimized your own approach and mindset to mental health? Maybe outside of rock climbing, is there anything that you've done separate, maybe that the film didn't show, that we could capture or indeed get an insight into?
Yeah, well, I think optimizing your mindset really relies on self-knowledge and just knowing how you respond to stresses. So for instance, I'm quite a routine-driven person. I thrive within routine, and that can either be a healthy routine or it can be an unhealthy routine, and you just have to make that switch. I think very much like a healthy mindset and routine, although it requires more effort, it's ultimately so much more productive. So when you're working back-to-back shifts, 12-hour shifts, I still try and find the time to make healthy food, to go for a run, or to do some kind of like strength or climbing based training. And it's that, it's that fundamental healthy body, healthy mind attitude. On the other side of the coin, you could just resort to stress eating, drinking after shifts as a way of winding down and coping, neglecting your body. And shift work, as we know, is very unhealthy for you. So it's about learning what your triggers are, how you operate within them, how you optimize your approach, and ultimately, you need to just find a way of coping, finding coping mechanisms that are healthy and that feel right for you. So I haven't been able to climb during either lockdown for lack of equipment, for lack of time, but I've tried to apply myself to other skills. And believe it or not, I found I'm doing a lot of handstanding at the moment and headstanding. I found that really helpful. I've always, it's a skill that I've always wanted to work on, and now is a golden opportunity. All you need is a square, a piece of floor to do it. And I'm a very goal-driven person, so I find goals really, really motivating. So I set myself the challenge in the first wave to do a 30-second handstand, and in the second wave I reached that, and in the second way to do a 1 minute handstand. So it's going pretty well, and it's fun, it's cool, it's a cool kind of skill to try and master. And I think seeing the world upside down is quite refreshing in a way. It's like having a new perspective, and it also taps into that focus and the attention to detail that I miss in climbing. You need almost obsessive attention to detail to kind of really see gains. And there's no, when you're doing it, when you're doing yoga, for instance, there's no intrusive thoughts. There's no room for any intrusive imagery. You really need to be in the moment to be present. And I mean, like I just touched upon yoga, and it's something that I've been doing more and more. And it probably helps that my girlfriend is a yoga instructor. But I mean, yoga was initially just a form of meditation. The original yogis, they kind of realized that actually sitting still wasn't the best way to focus the mind, and that actually movement was a very potent way to tap into that flow state. So when you do something like yoga, it requires a totally different part of the brain. And it's something that I use as a coping mechanism now, just to really remove myself from anything work related. So to answer your question, it's really for me about self-knowledge, about working within a structure, being disciplined, and prioritizing my health and fitness. So I'd be advocate for that.
Jerome, just looking at the movie does a really good job at documenting your experiences over a number of sort of days and or weeks, and your perspectives in the first wave of the COVID-19 pandemic. But could you speak to sort of the onslaught or daily triage that the public has to deal with around COVID, and sort of this heightened sense of awareness from a multitude of information versus what you see on the front line? How do you cope with this sort of daily triage, and or how should people cope with this almost overwhelming sense of triage of information around the pandemic?
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I mean, I think you have to be really selective about where you get your information from. So I basically have tuned out to most of the kind of typical news sources out there, and certainly nothing on social media. Don't touch it with a barge pole, and I've got colleagues who've done the same, colleagues who I really admire and respect, and who are normally very tapped into what's going on in current affairs and in the world. But I think it's really unhelpful to have this kind of frenzy of information out there. So you're just being really selective about, what you listen to, what you consume, and if needs be, just totally tuning out of it, because when you're dealing with it every day, it's just unhelpful, I think, to a certain extent, being bombarded to that level. So yeah, knowing what to consume, what to read, and when to totally leave it and to go and do some yoga.
And I think that ties into my next question, really, around there is a real self-care theme on the Wemcast podcasts. Just from the majority of guests really advocate self-care in a multitude of ways, really. And I suppose that notions towards self-care and in everything you were saying before, in your answers around yoga and how you eat and how you sleep and how you triage information. Is there any other ways that you would advocate maybe self-care in the staff to safeguard their mental health?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I mean, I think it's really easy to feel disempowered when you're at work, when you're doing shifts, and when you're, in the ambulance service. The nature of the work is that, you get pinged a job, you have no say in what it is, and you must attend it. So it's really easy to feel powerless, and I think trying to regain as much of that power or that self-determination as possible is no bad thing, and something I fully advocate. So, for instance, it's not an option for everyone, but I work banks, which is effectively a 0 hours contract. So I've tried to get a handle on my timetable so that I can prioritize climbing, for instance, or if you're a cyclist, going cycling. So getting that power, regaining that power, I think is essential. When I first joined the ambulance service, I really struggled to adapt to shift work and find that kind of work-life balance. It was totally skewed towards work. And I felt like I was missing out all the time. All my friends were going on these really epic sounding trips, and yeah, it was just it just wasn't sustainable. So that was when I made the decision to go bank, and to move to Sheffield as well, so I could be nearer to climbing and to the Peak District, which I love. So I think there's a lot that can be done as an individual, but there's also probably a lot more that can be done from a service or trust perspective. The LAS have done some really good things, really positive things, like offering bank contracts. They have things like self-rostering, where staff can actually decide, they still work full-time or 30 hours a week or whatever, but they're able to decide which days and which shifts and which places. But there are other options, there's part-time working. But I think a lot more can be done from trust to try and allow staff to be more empowered, to pursue, things outside of their career. And it would probably have a really positive impact on staff morale, which, as we know, is a very fragile thing.
So, Jerome, could you speak to any unintended positive aspects that the pandemic might have brought about, either in your own life or anecdotal observations that you've seen in other people?
Yeah. She's going to hate me for saying this, but I actually met my girlfriend at the end of the first wave. So that's a fantastic outcome, in my opinion. But I think there's probably also just a greater appreciation and recognition for health professionals in general. And maybe this is premature, but there's maybe a slight reshuffle in societal values. I think that we have to move away from financial greed as a society, from polluting industries, from societal and racial inequalities, which create so many disparities of health that we see on the front line, and in healthcare. So I hope that we can now start moving towards, a more equal society, which has a greater emphasis on health, on welfare, on the environment. So yeah, I mean, maybe that's a pie in the sky, but that'd be really nice.
So, Jerome, as we come to land on the conversation, could you just maybe illustrate to us what the results of winning the film festival have brought about? Has there been any sort of resultant feedback that you've got from viewers and/or opportunities that the film has brought about?
Yeah, I mean, the film has had just an incredible reception, overwhelming. So we won the best short film in Kendall, but we also won the People's Choice Award. So that was something that Nico and I had no idea about. So we went, canvassing or trying to, get people to vote for us. But essentially, it's a prize which is given. It's like a popular choice prize. So people who watched all the films at Kendall could select a film which they liked the most, and we're honoured to have won that, which is incredible. And Nico also wants to take it to several other film festivals. For him, it's a really big career break, so that's fantastic to see. A growth in his career towards adventure film. And just generally, it's been really nice, just strangers and friends and family, but also just random strangers coming up and sending messages of support and saying how much they enjoyed it, not just through the film, but I've tried to write as much as possible and speak as much as possible about the pandemic, so that people feel a bit more connected to it, and so they, I don't know, just understand it from our angle, which is, what we do is it's a privilege to be a paramedic or to be a healthcare worker, to serve our community, and to see life and death, the bleeding edge of it, to be right at the cutting edge. That's originally why I got into it. So it's just been phenomenal, people just coming up and expressing their gratitude or thanks, or it's been really, really touching.
So, Jerome, just if anyone wanted to watch it, the Rock Up Lockdown movie, how would they go about it? What's the easiest way to access the movie?
Well, I wish that it was publicly available at the moment, as in free to view, but sadly it's not. But the good news is that if you have Amazon Prime, then it's available there, both the UK and the US version. You could also purchase it for, I think, the small sum of £4.44 if you don't have Amazon Prime. It's just because Nico wants to take it to other film festivals, so I think it's just behind, it's behind paywalls at the moment. But at some point in the future, it will be available in the public domain, and I'm really thrilled for when that comes about. But until then, Amazon Prime is the way forward. I think it's available on Vimeo Pay as well, but yeah, just get yourself an Amazon Prime account or borrow someone else's details.
Listen, I paid £4.44 on Vimeo to watch it, and it's worth every penny. Actually, it's a fantastic short movie, only 10 minutes of your life, but it really is actually a fantastic insight. Shot beautifully. It really tells your narrative really nicely, and then transitions to the kind aesthetic, landscape and rock climbing, just in a beautiful way. The cinematography is great, and the soundtrack's great as well. So I was really impacted by it, and maybe it's because I am a paramedic, and my family are in Sheffield. My history is within London for 20 years, and I can identify with it. But it really struck a chord in me. So I would massively advocate people go and watch it. This Rock Up Lockdown. It's such a fantastic short little video.
Thank you very much, Ewan. I'm really touched. Yeah, it means a lot.
Listen, absolute pleasure. Jerome, absolute pleasure just speaking to you over the past hour. And if anyone wants to reach out to you, is there any which way, or would you rather direct them to the film? How would you prefer it?
Yeah, sure. I mean, if people want to get in touch, directly, then they can email me. My email us jerome.mowat@gmail.com. I've got Instagram as well, which is just my name, so they can just send me a direct message. So yeah, I mean, I've welcome any feedback or comments or people's stories. It's really, I think it's really important to discuss people's people's experience of the pandemic, because it's been a really unsettling and quite a traumatizing time for some people, not just healthcare workers, but patients and patients' relatives, and I think each healthcare profession always feels sorry for the next. So we feel like we've had it bad, but we haven't had it as bad as like the A&E nurses, who haven't had it as bad as the critical care nurses, and so on. So yeah, I think it's really important to hear each other's stories, and I think there's actually like a lack of voices from the grassroots. There's, whenever we hear anything from the ambulance service, it's always from management, and that will give you a very down the line and quite a dull reflection of what's going on. So I think I would encourage anyone who is grassroots healthcare worker to make themselves heard and to share their story, because I think it's a really positive thing, and it's a really great way of like processing what's happened.
I completely agree with that, Jerome. And I think it's that fundamental organic narrative around their anecdotal experience on the front line is powerful. And I wholeheartedly agree. Jerome Mowat, listen, it's been an absolute pleasure speaking to you, and thank you so much.
Thanks very much, Eoin. Pleasure.